I left the office at 5 o'clock sharp, just as my contract specified. At 5:07, he screamed at me in the main lobby right in front of the entire finance department. 90 minutes later, the $720 million IPO he was leading froze permanently. I didn't do anything wrong. I just followed procedure. But he picked the wrong person to scream at. My name is Lena Wakefield, and I've spent 8 years building a reputation as someone who doesn't miss details. At 32, I've audited enough financial operations to know when something smells wrong. That Monday morning in late September, when Bradley Houghton walked into Ardentium Metrics as our new VP of Strategic Development, the stench was immediate. I was already at my desk by 7:30, reviewing vendor compliance reports for the upcoming quarter. The Charlotte skyline gleamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our 14th floor office, all glass and steel pretension. Ardentium had that startup trying to be corporate feel ping-pong tables next to conference rooms, named after tech moguls, cold brew on tap, beside stacks of SEC filing documents. Bradley made his entrance like he owned the place, which technically with his 15% equity stake, he partially did. Armani suit, Hermes tie, and that particular swagger of investment bankers who think Excel sheets are beneath them. He'd come from Harrington Securities, where he'd supposedly orchestrated 3 unicorn IPOs. The financial press loved him, called him the closer. I watched from my corner office, yes, I'd earned that, as he glad-handed his way through introductions. When our eyes met, his smile faltered for a microsecond. Maybe he sensed what I was, someone who actually read the fine print. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for 9. Bradley commanded the room like a tent revival preacher selling salvation through stock options. "We're not just taking Ardentium public," he announced, loosening his tie for effect. "We're going to show Wall Street what Charlotte can do. $720 million valuation, and that's just the starting point." People applauded. I took notes. "But here's the thing," he continued, pacing now. "IPOs aren't won by clockwatchers. They're won by warriors. By people who understand that leaving at 5 is leaving money on the table." My pen stopped moving. Around me, younger employees nodded eagerly, already calculating their potential windfall. I'd seen this movie before. The protagonist never looked like me, a black woman who'd clawed her way up from community college to CPA to head of financial operations. But I knew how it ended. The meeting dispersed with the usual corporate enthusiasm. I returned to my desk and pulled up our vendor approval matrix. Something had been nagging at me since the announcement. Bradley's timeline, 4 weeks to IPO, was aggressive. Too aggressive for a company with our complexity of international suppliers. By 4:45, I'd identified 3 vendors with incomplete KYC documentation. One name made me pause: Halverson Trust, registered in Delaware, but with payment routing through Nassau. I'd flagged them 6 months ago for circular transactions with a subsidiary. The flag had been cleared by someone above my pay grade, but the documentation was thin. I added a note to the file: requires enhanced due diligence per Regulation 114A, potential affiliate overlap with offshore entities. At 4:58, I saved my work, backed up my files to my personal cloud, a habit that had saved me twice before, and shut down my computer. My contract specified core hours of 8 to 5. I'd learned long ago that contracts were the only protection people like me had against people like Bradley Houghton. The elevator was empty when I stepped in at 5:01. By the time it reached the lobby, I was already thinking about my evening run through Freedom Park. The doors opened to reveal Bradley standing there, face flushed, flanked by 3 members of the finance team who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Wakefield," he said my name like it tasted bad. "Going somewhere? Home?" I kept my voice level, professional. "Is there something you need? Is there something He stepped closer. I could smell his cologne, something expensive and trying too hard. "We're 4 weeks from the biggest moment in this company's history, and you're punching out like some union factory worker." The lobby had gone quiet. The security guard at the desk was suddenly very interested in his monitors. The finance team shifted uncomfortably behind Bradley, probably calculating whether they should stay late tonight just to be safe. My hours are 8 to 5, I said. If you need to discuss modifying my contract, we should involve HR. That's when he screamed. Who the hell leaves at 5? This ain't kindergarten. You think you're going to coast into a 7-figure payout, working banker's hours? You work for me now, and in my world, we don't leave until the job is done. His voice echoed off the marble walls. Spittle flew from his mouth. His face had turned an alarming shade of red that clashed with his purple tie. I stood there calm as a midnight lake and let him finish. When he paused for breath, I spoke just loud enough for everyone to hear. I'll see you tomorrow at 8. Then I walked past him through the revolving doors and into the September evening. But I didn't go home. Not right away. I sat in my car in the parking garage and opened my laptop. The file I'd been working on, IPO Risk Matrix V7 draft, was still in my recent documents. I created a copy, renamed it IPO Risk Matrix V7 Personal Backup, and saved it to 3 different locations. Then I opened a new document and began typing. September 23rd, 5:07 p.m. Bradley Houghton, VP Strategic Development, verbally assaulted me in the company lobby in front of witnesses for adhering to my contractual hours. Witnesses present Michael Torres, Finance, Jennifer Sue, Finance, David Okonkwo, Finance, and Roberto Silva, Security. I saved this to multiple times, multiple places, because I knew something Bradley Houghton didn't. In financial operations, the most dangerous person isn't the one who yells. It's the one who documents. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of false cheerfulness that follows workplace drama. People smiled too wide, spoke too carefully, and avoided eye contact like we were all complicit in something shameful. I arrived at 7:45 to find my keycard wouldn't open the executive floor's secured server room. System update, said Marcus from IT, not meeting my eyes. Should be fixed by noon. Strange. We'd had a system update 2 weeks ago. I logged into my workstation and navigated to the shared drive where all vendor compliance reports lived. The folder structure looked different, cleaner, emptier. My stomach tightened as I clicked through subdirectories. The KYC documentation I'd been reviewing yesterday gone. Not just archived or moved, deleted. The version history showed the last modification at 11:37 p.m. yesterday, user ID B. Houghton. I pulled up my email and searched for the automated backup confirmations. Nothing after 5 p.m. yesterday. Our enterprise backup system mysteriously stopped capturing changes right after I'd left the building. Leena Mo, Raj Patel. My deputy appeared at my door looking uncomfortable. Bradley's called a department meeting, 8:30. The conference room was packed. Bradley stood at the head of the table, all smiles and casual authority, yesterday's rage apparently forgotten. He'd traded the Armani for business casual, probably read somewhere that it made him more approachable. Team, he began, clapping his hands together. I want to apologize for yesterday. Passion got the better of me. We're all on the same side here, working toward the same goal. A few people relaxed. I didn't. That said, he continued, we need to streamline our processes. I've taken the liberty of reorganizing our vendor documentation system. Too much redundancy, too many versions floating around. From now on, we'll be working from a single source of truth. He clicked to a slide showing a simplified folder structure. All the complexity I'd built, the audit trails, the flag system, the enhanced review protocols, reduced to a single column labeled Approved Vendors. Questions. I raised my hand. What happened to the historical documentation? Archived, he said smoothly. We don't need 5 years of paper trails slowing us down. If a vendor's approved, they're approved. Clean slate. The SEC requires documentation of current status, he interrupted, which we have. Next question. There were no next questions. People were already calculating their stock options, dividing 720 million by headcount, forgetting that IPOs were built on details, not dreams. Back at my desk, I opened my personal laptop and logged into my cloud storage. Everything was there, every report, every flag, every email trail. But something else caught my eye. In my meticulous review yesterday, I'd noticed several vendors in the approved category that I'd never seen before. Now, cross-referencing with my personal backup, I could see the pattern. Halverson Trust wasn't alone. There were 6 other entities all approved within the last 3 months, all with Delaware registrations and offshore payment structures. All approved by the same user ID J. Malone. Jessica Malone had left the company 8 weeks ago. Her exit had been sudden personal reasons, HR had said. I'd inherited her pending reviews, but these approvals weren't in the handover documentation. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts. Jessica and I weren't friends exactly, but we'd bonded over being 2 of the few women in senior finance roles. Her number was still there. She answered on the 3rd ring. Lena, I wasn't expecting. Jessica, I need to ask you something. Off the record. A pause. I can't talk about Ardentium. I'm not asking you to. I just need to know, did you approve a vendor called Halverson Trust? The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Then, Lena, be careful. Jessica. I have to go. The line went dead. I spent the rest of the morning reconstructing what I could from public records. Delaware's business registry showed Halverson Trust Incorporated just 4 months ago. The registered agent was a law firm known for its discretion. But buried in the fine print was a name Holloway Holdings listed as a member of the trust. Holloway Holdings. Why did that sound familiar? I pulled up Bradley's LinkedIn profile. Previous positions at Harrington Securities, Goldman Sachs, and Holloway Capital Partners. The pieces clicked together with an almost audible snap. Bradley wasn't just pushing an aggressive IPO timeline. He was funneling company contracts through entities he controlled, inflating our vendor relationships to boost valuation. It was elegant in its simplicity and breathtaking in its audacity. My desk phone rang. I know Wakefield. Miss Wakefield, this is Diane from HR. Could you come up to the 20th floor? We need to discuss some concerns that have been raised. Concerns? About your performance and your attitude. I closed my eyes and counted to 3. I'll be right up. But first I made one more copy of everything. This time I encrypted it and emailed it to an address no one at Ardentium knew about my attorney's secure client portal. Patricia Nguyen had helped me negotiate my original contract. She'd told me then, hope for the best, but always have an exit strategy. The elevator ride to HR felt longer than usual. By the time I reached the 20th floor, I'd already decided Bradley Houghton had no idea what he'd started yesterday at 5:07 p.m. But he was about to find out that some people didn't need to yell to be dangerous. Some people just needed to be right, and patient, and very, very thorough. The all-hands meeting on Thursday was pure theater. Bradley commanded the auditorium stage like a televised evangelist, complete with a wireless mic and laser pointer. Behind him, a countdown clock displayed 22 days to IPO in aggressive red numerals. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not just going public, he declared, his voice carrying that manufactured enthusiasm of someone who'd given this speech before. We are going to redefine what a tech IPO looks like. $720 million isn't our ceiling, it's our floor. The room erupted in carefully orchestrated applause. I sat in the back row taking notes on my tablet. Every claim, every promise, every timeline, all documented with timestamps. Now, Bash, Bradley continued, clicking to a slide titled Operation Velocity. Traditional IPO prep takes 6 months minimum. We're doing it in 4 weeks. How? He paused for effect. By cutting through the bureaucracy, by trusting our approved partners, by moving at the speed of innovation, not the speed of paperwork. A hand shot up from the legal department. What about regulatory compliance the SEC requires? The SEC, Bradley interrupted with a practiced smile, requires accuracy, not archaeology. Our vendor relationships are solid. Our contracts are clean. We don't need to relitigate settled business. He clicked to the next slide, a simplified flowchart showing vendor approval flowing through a single checkpoint. My checkpoint, which had been reduced from a comprehensive review process to a rubber stamp. Every department needs to commit to the velocity principle, he continued. Legal reviews, 72 hours max. Financial validations, 24 hours. Vendor verifications, already complete. That last part made me look up from my notes. Already complete, I hadn't signed off on anything since Monday. Questions. Sarah Martinez from Legal raised her hand again. Some of these timelines seem ambitious, Bradley grinned. That's the point. Amazon didn't become Amazon by thinking small. Tesla didn't revolutionize transportation by following conventional wisdom. We're not here to be another forgotten IPO. We're here to make history. More applause. I noticed several department heads exchanging glances, the kind that said, "Cover your ass," in corporate semaphore. After the meeting, I returned to find Raj hovering near my office. "Boss, you need to see this." He handed me a printout from our contract management system. 17 new vendor agreements, all marked as approved financial operations with my electronic signature. All dated within the last 48 hours. All during times when I was either in HR meetings or locked out of the system. "This isn't my approval," I said quietly. "I know." Raj lowered his voice. "But the system shows your credentials. It says there's no evidence of unauthorized access." I studied the contracts. Mixed in with legitimate suppliers were our friends from Tuesday Halverson Trust, now listed as a strategic technology partner with a $5 million annual contract. The others were similarly inflated, turning what should have been standard service agreements into major financial commitments. "Raj, I need you to do something for me." I pulled out a USB drive from my desk drawer, one of several I'd started carrying. "Make a backup of everything. Every contract, every approval log, every system timestamp. Store it somewhere safe off-site." His eyes widened. "Lena?" "Just as a precaution. System redundancy." I forced a smile. "You know me. I like my backups to have backups." That afternoon, Bradley called a finance leadership meeting. 5 of us gathered in the executive conference room, the one with the glass walls that made every meeting feel like a fishbowl exhibition. "I'll cut to the chase," Bradley said, dispensing with pleasantries. "We need to show consistent vendor relationships going back at least 12 months. Some of our newer partners need to be backdated in the system, for continuity." The room went silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. "That's fraud," said Michael Torres, the same finance manager who'd witnessed Monday's lobby incident. "That's interpretation," Bradley corrected. "These are existing relationships that weren't properly documented. We're simply correcting administrative oversights." "I won't sign off on that," I said. Bradley's jaw tightened, but his smile remained. "You already have. Check the system." I pulled up the contract portal on my laptop. There they were, addendums to each suspicious vendor agreement backdating the relationships to January. All with my electronic signature, all approved while I was sitting in this very room. "This is illegal," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "Prove it." Bradley's mask finally slipped, revealing the predator underneath. "Your credentials, your approvals, your electronic signature. As far as anyone can tell, you've been approving these all along." In fact, he leaned back, savoring the moment. "If there's any irregularity, it would appear to be your oversight, your failure to properly document existing relationships." The trap was elegant. Fight it, and I'd look like I was covering up my own incompetence. Accept it, and I'd be complicit in securities fraud. Either way, Bradley won. "Now," he continued, "we can do this the easy way or the hard way. The easy way, you continue your excellent work supporting our IPO timeline. The hard way," he shrugged, "well, financial professionals who can't manage basic vendor documentation don't tend to have long careers, especially not in Charlotte. It's a small financial community." The meeting ended with everyone except Bradley looking like they'd swallowed glass. As we filed out, Michael caught my arm. "What are you going to do?" he whispered. I looked back at Bradley, who was already on his phone, probably calling his Holloway Holdings partners to report the good news. "Exactly what he expects," I said. "My job." But that night I did more than my job. I compiled every piece of evidence into a single encrypted folder labeled Project Velocity Documentation. Then I did something Bradley would never expect from a clock watcher like me. I started reading SEC whistleblower provisions, particularly the sections about quitam rewards for exposing IPO fraud. Turns out the government pays quite well for inside information about securities violations. Up to 30% of recovered funds. 30% of a fraudulent $720 million IPO would be considerable. Bradley thought he'd backed me into a corner. He was right. But corners are where trapped animals become most dangerous. And I wasn't just any trapped animal. I was a CPA with 8 years of forensic accounting experience, a photographic memory for regulations, and personal copies of every single document he thought he'd destroyed. Friday morning's summons to HR felt like a formality. I'd been expecting it since Bradley's trap snapped shut in yesterday's meeting. Diane from HR sat across from me, flanked by someone from legal I'd never seen before, young, nervous, clearly uncomfortable with whatever role he'd been assigned. Lena, Diane began with the practiced sympathy of someone who'd given this speech before. We've received some concerning feedback about your performance and attitude. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap. Could you be more specific? She glanced at her notes. Multiple team members have reported that you're uncooperative, resistant to new processes, and creating a hostile work environment. Who specifically reported this? That's confidential. What matters is the pattern. You've been described as inflexible, overly rigid in your interpretations of policy and... She paused, as if the next words physically pained her, not aligned with Ardentium's evolving culture. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Even he could smell the setup. I see. I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table. Do you mind if I record this conversation for my records? That won't be necessary, Diane said quickly. We're simply having an informal discussion about performance improvement. Then I'm free to leave. She exchanged glances with the lawyer. We'd like to offer you an opportunity. Given the stress of the upcoming IPO, we think it might be beneficial for you to take some paid time off. 2 weeks to recalibrate. There it was, sidelined during the crucial IPO prep period. By the time I returned, every fraudulent contract would be baked into the filing, every backdated agreement would be historical fact. That's very generous, I said. But I have responsibilities. The vendor audit alone will be handled by the transition team Bradley is assembling. You don't need to worry about that. I see. I stood up. Do I have a choice in this matter? Diane's smile was apologetic but firm. We really think it's for the best, for everyone. 20 minutes later, I was escorted to my office by security, standard procedure. They assured me to collect my personal items. They watched as I packed my coffee mug, my pictures, my awards from the North Carolina Society of CPAs. They didn't notice the USB drives I'd been strategically placing around my office for weeks, each one taped under drawers behind picture frames inside the spine of my CPA study guide. I'll need to transfer my work files, I said, gesturing to my computer. It will handle that, the guard replied. Your access has been suspended pending your return. Of course it had. As they walked me out past the cubicles of colleagues, who suddenly found their screens fascinating, past the break room where conversation died mid-sentence, past Bradley's corner office where he didn't even bother to look up, I felt oddly calm. They thought they were removing an obstacle. They were actually lighting a fuse. That afternoon, I drove to Myers Park, the old money neighborhood where Charlotte's established families still held court behind magnolia trees and wrought iron gates. The address Jessica Malone had texted me led to a Tudor-style house that whispered, rather than shouted, its wealth. Jessica answered the door herself. She'd lost weight since leaving Ardentium, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. You shouldn't be here. I need 5 minutes. She glanced over her shoulder, then stepped aside. 5 minutes. Her living room looked like a legal war room, boxes of documents, printed emails, yellow legal pads covered in notes. Let me guess, I said. Voluntary resignation for personal reasons. Mutual separation with full NDA. She laughed bitterly. $50,000 in severance to keep my mouth shut about Bradley's vendor scheme. What happened? Jessica walked to the window, watching the street like she expected corporate spies. I pushed back when he asked me to approve Halverson. Told him I needed full documentation. Next thing I know, I'm in HR being accused of mishandling confidential information. They had emails I'd supposedly sent to competitors, all from my account, all during times I wasn't even in the office. The same playbook he's using on me. Except I folded. She turned back, eyes hard. I had a daughter starting college, a mortgage, a mother in assisted living. I couldn't afford to fight. What if you didn't have to fight alone? She studied me for a long moment. What are you thinking? I pulled out one of my USB drives. I have everything. Every original document, every timestamp, every altered record. But I need corroboration. Someone who can testify to the pattern. I signed an NDA, which doesn't cover illegal activity. Securities fraud voids non-disclosure agreements. Jessica walked to one of her document boxes and pulled out a folder. Marla Goines. She was in vendor management before me. Left 6 months ago, right after Bradley joined. Said she was moving back to Chicago, but I heard she's still in Charlotte, working at Bank of America now. She handed me a business card. Marla saw it coming before any of us. She might talk if you approach it right. Why didn't you go to the authorities? Jessica's smile was sad. With what, my word against Bradley Houghton, the golden boy of IPOs, plus whatever fabricated evidence they'd suddenly discover on my work computer, I took the money and ran. But you kept documents. Insurance policy, in case they came after me again. She walked me to the door. Be careful, Lena. Bradley doesn't just ruin careers. He destroys people. Whatever you're planning, make sure you can finish it. That night I sat in my home office surrounded by printed regulations and highlighter pens. The SEC's Office of the Whistleblower had strict procedures, specific forms, detailed requirements. One mistake, one missed deadline, one improper disclosure, and the complaint would be dismissed. But they also had something else, a 21-day review period for IPO filings. Bradley's 4-week timeline suddenly made sense. File the IPO registration before anyone could properly investigate the vendor relationships. Once the S-1 was submitted, momentum would carry it through. The SEC would focus on financial statements and disclosures, not the underlying vendor contracts. By the time anyone thought to look deeper, Ardentium would be public, Bradley would have his payout, and the shell companies would quietly disappear. Unless someone gave the SEC a reason to look closer. Someone with inside knowledge, documented evidence, and the patience to build an airtight case. I picked up my phone and dialed Patricia Nguyen's after-hours number. Patricia, it's Lena Wakefield. I need to discuss whistleblower protections and quitam provisions under Dodd-Frank. Now. And I need you to recommend the best securities fraud attorney in Charlotte. Someone who's not afraid of Bradley Houghton or his connections. There was a pause. How big is this? I looked at my evidence wall printouts, connected with red string like some conspiracy theorist's fever dream, except every connection was documented, every link was verified. $720 million big, and that's just the starting point. The law offices of Garrett Morrison and Associates occupied the top floor of a building that overlooked Trade and Tryon Charlotte's financial crossroads. Patricia had made good on her promise. Thomas Garrett himself agreed to see me on a Saturday morning, which told me everything about how seriously they took the case. Miss Wakefield, Garrett greeted me, his handshake firm, despite being north of 70. Patricia says you have evidence of securities fraud in an upcoming IPO. I have more than evidence, I said, placing a white USB drive on his mahogany desk. I have the entire paper trail. For the next 2 hours, I walked him through everything. The mysterious vendor approvals, the backdated contracts, the forged electronic signatures, Bradley's connections to the shell companies. Garrett took notes in shorthand, occasionally asking questions that cut straight to legal relevance. This USB, he said finally, is this the only copy? No, I have multiple backups in secure locations. Good. He leaned back, fingers steepled. What you're describing is a textbook case of accounting fraud designed to inflate company valuation. The SEC will be very interested, but there's a problem. My stomach tightened. What problem? You were the head of financial operations. Your electronic signature is on these documents. Bradley Houghton has plausible deniability. He's new, he relied on existing approvals. You, on the other hand, Look at the timestamps, I interrupted. Cross-reference them with my building access logs, my meeting schedules. I can prove I wasn't even at my computer when most of these approvals went through. Can you? Or will the logs show exactly what Bradley wants them to show? The weight of his words settled on me like a lead blanket. Of course Bradley would have thought of that. Of course he'd have covered those tracks too. However, Garrett continued, there is another way. The SEC offers immunity to whistleblowers who provide substantial assistance in uncovering fraud. But we need more than documents. We need testimony from others involved, evidence of Bradley's direct participation, and ideally proof of intent. I can get that. Be careful. If Bradley suspects you're building a case, I'm on administrative leave. As far as he knows, I'm sitting at home defeated. Garrett smiled for the first time. Good. Stay defeated. Meanwhile, I'll prepare the SEC filing. We'll need to move fast once that S1 is submitted. Our leverage decreases significantly. I spent the weekend following breadcrumbs. Marla Goines agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in Dilworth, far from Ardentium's sphere of influence. She was exactly as Jessica had described, sharp, prepared, and angry. Bradley tried the same thing with me, she said, sliding a folder across the table. These are the original vendor assessment forms for Halverson Trust and 3 other companies. Notice anything? I studied the documents. The company addresses were all variations of the same building in Delaware. The tax ID numbers were sequential. The authorized signatories all had names that were slight variations of each other. M. Harrison, M. Harris H. Morrison. Shell companies, I said. Worse, look at the bank routing numbers. I compared them to my own records. They all traced back to accounts at First Caribbean International Bank, Nassau branch. The same bank Bradley had used during his time at Holloway Capital. He's running a classic pump and dump, Marla continued. Inflate the IPO with fake vendor relationships, cash out his equity stake post-lockup, then watch the house of cards collapse. Except this time he's using Ardentium's own money to fund the scheme. Will you testify to this? She nodded. I've been waiting 6 months for someone to ask. Monday came with an unexpected development. My personal phone rang at 8:15, Raj calling from his cell. Don't talk, just listen, he said quickly. There's a preservation notice on your personnel file. Legal hold all electronic records. Someone's building a case against you. Who authorized it? Bradley. But here's the interesting part, he also had "Itty pull your backup logs. He knows you've been copying files. My blood chilled. Thanks, Raj, be careful. Lena. Whatever you're doing, do it fast. The S1 filing is scheduled for next Monday. 7 days. I had 7 days to stop a $720 million fraud. That afternoon, I did something Bradley would never expect. I went to Ardentium. Not through the front door, but to the loading dock where the contract security guards worked. Roberto Silva was there, the same guard who'd witnessed the lobby incident. Miss Wakefield, he said, surprised. Thought you were on vacation. Roberto, I need to ask you something. That night Mr. Houghton yelled at me, do the security cameras cover the lobby? He glanced around nervously. They do, but what? Funny thing. That whole day's recordings got corrupted. System glitch, they said. Only happened to the lobby cameras, only for that 12-hour period. Of course, but Roberto was still talking. Good thing I always back up my incident reports to personal cloud. Company policy says no, but after 15 years in security, you learn to cover yourself. That whole scene is in my written report, time-stamped and everything. I could have hugged him. Would you be willing to share that report? Miss Wakefield, you were the only executive who ever learned my name, remembered my kid's graduation. That man disrespected you in front of everyone. He pulled out his phone. What's your email? By Wednesday, I had assembled what prosecutors would call a pattern of conduct. 7 former employees, all with similar stories. All pushed out after questioning vendor relationships. All with documentation they'd kept despite NDAs. But I still needed the smoking gun, direct evidence of Bradley's involvement. The shell companies were suspicious, but a good lawyer could argue he'd been deceived too. I needed proof he controlled them. The break came from an unexpected source. My doorbell rang at 9 p.m. Wednesday night. Michael Torres stood on my porch, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "I can't do this anymore," he said. "I need to show you something." He handed me a laptop. Bradley had me set up QuickBooks access for the new vendors. Routine stuff, except he insisted on creating the credentials himself. Said it was for security. And I got curious. Ran a network trace on the login attempts. He opened a spreadsheet. Every single access to these vendor accounts comes from the same IP address, not their registered business addresses, Bradley's home office. There it was. Digital proof that Bradley was personally managing the financials of the shell companies he claimed were independent vendors. "Michael, this is evidence of fraud." "I know. I have a family, Lena. 2 kids. I can't lose this job, but I can't go to prison either." "You won't. Whistleblowers who cooperate early get protection. Let me call my attorney." As Michael spoke with Garrett's team, I sat back and looked at what we'd built. A $720 million house of cards, documented from every angle. Bradley Houghton thought he'd removed an obstacle when he forced me out. Instead, he'd created his worst nightmare, a meticulous accountant with nothing left to lose, and all the time in the world to prove it. The USB drive on my desk seemed to pulse with possibility. 7 days to filing. 7 days to save a company from fraud. 7 days to show Bradley Houghton why you should never underestimate a woman who leaves at 5. Because leaving on time meant I had all evening to build the case that would destroy him. Thursday morning brought rain to Charlotte, the kind that turned the city's glass towers into mirrors of gray sky. In my home office, I stared at the email that had arrived at 6:43 a.m. from Ardentium's General Counsel Sandra Kowalski. Internal audit matter. Confidential attorney-client privilege. The message was carefully worded, all legal precision and corporate doublespeak. But the meaning was clear. They were launching an internal investigation into financial irregularities in the vendor approval process. My name appeared 7 times, always in connection with questionable documentation and breach of fiduciary duty. They were building their case against me. Thomas Garrett called within minutes of my forwarding him the email. "They're trying to get ahead of our SEC filing," he said. "Classic defensive move. Create an internal investigation that points the finger at you, then claim they were victims of a rogue employee. What do? We accelerate. I'm filing with the SEC tomorrow morning. But Lena, once we do this, there's no going back. Ardentium will come at you with everything they have. Let them come." That afternoon, I met with Patricia Nguyen to execute the formal whistleblower documents. As I signed my name to the SEC complaint, I thought about every woman who'd been silenced by men like Bradley Houghton. Every employee who'd been steamrolled for doing their job. Every person who'd been told their integrity was an inconvenience. "There's something else," Patricia said after I'd signed. "Garrett wants you to do one more thing before the filing. Create a preservation letter for Ardentium's legal department demanding they maintain all records related to the vendor approvals. Send it tonight after business hours." "Why?" "Because the moment they receive it, they're legally obligated to stop any document destruction. And if Bradley is planning to delete anything else, he'll have to do it today." I smiled. "Before he knows we're on to him." I spent the rest of Thursday crafting the perfect preservation letter. Dry, technical, but comprehensive enough to cover every digital footprint Bradley might try to erase. I scheduled it to send at 8 p.m., then prepared my own documentation for one final backup. At 4:30, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Check your email. A friend." The email contained a single attachment, Security Cam Archive Lobby, SEPT23, MP4. My hands shook as I clicked play. There it was. The entire lobby incident, Bradley's red face contorted in rage, his finger jabbing at me, spit flying as he screamed. The timestamp in the corner read 5:07 p.m. The audio was crystal clear. "Who the hell leaves at 5? This ain't kindergarten." Someone had saved the footage before it was deleted. Someone who knew I'd need it. I called Garrett immediately. "I have video of Bradley's assault." Assault. In North Carolina, screaming at someone with aggressive physical gestures can constitute assault. At minimum, it establishes a pattern of workplace hostility and retaliation. Send it over. This changes our filing significantly. As I uploaded the video to Garrett's secure server, another piece clicked into place. Roberto hadn't just written a report, he'd made his own backup of the security footage. The man who everyone ignored, who executives walked past without seeing, had quietly protected evidence that would help bring down a $720 million fraud. That evening, as my preservation letter winged its way to Ardentium's legal department, I sat on my porch and watched the storm clouds gather over Charlotte's skyline. Somewhere in one of those towers, Bradley Houghton was probably celebrating, counting down to Monday's IPO filing, calculating his future millions. He had no idea that in less than 12 hours, the SEC would receive a 147-page complaint documenting every fraudulent contract, every forged approval, every shell company transaction. Attached would be sworn affidavits from 8 former employees. Michael's network traces Marla's original vendor assessments, and Roberto's video of a VP assaulting an employee for following her contract. My phone rang at 7:58 p.m., Raj breathless. Lena Bradley just called an emergency meeting for all department heads. 8 p.m. He's requiring everyone to bring their laptops and company phones. Why? He says it's for an urgent security update. But Lena, I overheard him talking to IT. They're planning to remote wipe devices, something about a potential data breach. 2 minutes until my preservation letter hit their inboxes. Once it did, any device wiping would be destruction of evidence, obstruction of justice, criminal charges on top of securities fraud. Raj, listen carefully. In exactly 2 minutes, step out of that meeting. Say you need the bathroom. Whatever happens, do not let them touch your devices after 8 p.m. Lena, what's... Just trust me. And Raj, thank you for everything. 8 p.m. came and went. I imagined Sandra Kowalski's face when she opened my preservation letter, the legal implications dawning like a cold sunrise. I imagined Bradley in his emergency meeting maybe just getting word that they couldn't proceed with the wipe, that any destruction of evidence was now a federal crime. But mostly I imagined Monday morning at the SEC, when a team of enforcement attorneys would open their encrypted files to find the complete anatomy of a fraud, dissected with the precision only a spurned accountant could provide. My phone buzzed. Patricia. Letter delivered and confirmed received. Ardentium Legal is in panic mode. Garrett says to expect company counsel to contact you within hours. Another text, this one from Michael. Bradley just stormed out of the meeting. Threw a laptop against the wall. Says someone betrayed the company. No Bradley. Someone saved it. I closed my eyes and let the rain wash over the city. In my mind, I could see the dominoes starting to fall, each shell company, each forged document, each backdated contract tumbling into the next. Bradley Houghton had built his scheme on the assumption that people like me would always choose security over integrity, silence over truth. He'd calculated wrong. Tomorrow, the SEC would begin their investigation. Next week, instead of a triumphant IPO, Ardentium would face federal investigators armed with the most dangerous weapon in corporate America, the truth meticulously documented and delivered by someone who left at 5. I pulled out my personal laptop and opened a new document. Time to update my resume. After all, Charlotte's financial community was small, but there were plenty of companies that valued executives who understood the difference between creative accounting and criminal fraud. Companies that wouldn't scream at you for honoring your contract. Companies that understood that integrity wasn't a weakness, it was a weapon. And I just demonstrated exactly how sharp that weapon could be. Friday arrived with the kind of clear sky that made Charlotte's financial district gleam like a promise. By 9 a.m., Thomas Garrett had confirmed the SEC's receipt of our complaint. By 10, Ardentium's board had called an emergency session. By 11, my phone hadn't stopped ringing. The first call I took was from Sandra Kowalski herself. Lena, we need to talk, in person, today. I don't think that's appropriate without my attorney present. This isn't... She paused, and I could hear the careful calculation in her silence. This is off the record. Bradley Houghton needs to speak with you. He's willing to discuss a resolution. A resolution. A mutually beneficial arrangement. Can you come to the office at 2? I looked at the recording app on my phone, the one that had been running since she identified herself. I'll consider it. The second I hung up, I called Garrett. They want to meet. Bradley specifically. Absolutely not, he said immediately. They're either trying to intimidate you or negotiate a cover-up. Either way. I want to go. Lena. With a wire. North Carolina is a one-party consent state. If Bradley tries to threaten me or offer a bribe, we'll have it on tape. There was a long pause. I'll send someone from my office with you. And Lena, the moment you feel unsafe, you leave. At 1:45, I walked into Ardentium's building for what I assumed would be the last time. The security guard, not Roberto, someone new, didn't make eye contact as he issued my visitor badge. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like ascending to a tribunal. Bradley's office had been transformed into a war room. Lawyers filled every chair, documents covered every surface, and the air itself seemed thick with desperation. Bradley stood behind his desk, tie-loosened sleeves rolled up, looking like he'd aged 5 years in as many days. Lena. He tried for his usual commanding tone, but couldn't quite manage it. Thank you for coming. What do you want, Bradley? He glanced at his lawyers, then back at me. I want to understand why you're doing this. We're 4 days from a $720 million IPO. Do you know how many jobs depend on this? How many people's retirements? The same people you were defrauding with shell companies. His jaw tightened. Those are legitimate vendors. Cut the act. I remained standing, refusing his gesture to sit. Halverson Trust is registered to a P.O. box in Delaware. Its bank accounts trace to Nassau. You personally logged into their QuickBooks 17 times in the last month from your home IP address. Would you like me to continue? The color drained from his face. One of the lawyers started to speak, but Bradley held up a hand. What do you want? He asked quietly. I wanted to do my job. You made that impossible. Everyone has a price. He moved around the desk and I instinctively stepped back. Name yours. 2,300,000. I can make it happen. Cash untraceable offshore. You could retire tomorrow. I felt the wire against my ribs, recording every word. Are you attempting to bribe a federal witness? I'm trying to save this company. His composure finally cracked the mask, slipping to reveal the desperate man underneath. You think you're some hero? You're going to destroy hundreds of careers because you can't handle criticism, because I yelled at you once. You committed securities fraud. You forged my signature. You tried to frame me for your crimes. I gave you an opportunity to be part of something bigger than yourself, to think like a winner instead of some, he gestured dismissively, 9-to-5 drone who can't see past her desktop calculator. There it was, the real Bradley Houghton. Not the polished executive or the charismatic leader, but a small man who confused crime with creativity, bullying with leadership. We're done here, I said, turning to leave. You walk out that door and I'll bury you. His voice had dropped to a near whisper, all pretense of negotiation gone. I have resources you can't imagine. Connections at every firm in Charlotte. Every bank, every fund, every company that might hire you. You'll never work in finance again. I stopped at the door and looked back at him, this man who thought power meant the ability to destroy others. Bradley, I said calmly, I've already sent everything to the SEC. Your vendor contracts, your shell companies, your offshore accounts. Michael Torres provided the network logs. Marla Goines has the original assessments. Roberto Silva saved the security footage of you assaulting me. 8 former employees have given sworn statements. His face cycled through emotions, disbelief, rage, fear. Oh, and Bradley. This conversation is being recorded. You just committed witness intimidation and attempted bribery of a federal witness. That's 10 years minimum on top of the securities fraud. I opened the door to find Sandra Kowalski standing there, her face pale as printer paper. Sandra, I acknowledged, walking past her, you'll want to call outside counsel. Your general counsel just became a witness. The elevator ride down was the longest and shortest of my life. In the lobby, I saw Roberto at his station. He gave me the slightest nod, the kind of acknowledgement that said more than words could. I nodded back and walked out into the Charlotte sunshine. Garrett's associate was waiting in the car, practically vibrating with excitement. "Did you get it?" I pulled out the recording device. Everything, including a job threat that constitutes economic extortion under federal law. My phone buzzed. "Raj, Bradley just got escorted out by security. Board called an emergency shareholder meeting. IPO is officially dead." Another text, this one from Michael. "Thank you. We all knew, but nobody had the courage. Thank you." As we drove away from Ardentium's gleaming tower, I thought about courage. How it wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, the simple act of saying no, of keeping copies of leaving at 5, because that's what your contract said. Bradley had mistaken my adherence to rules for weakness, my precision for pedantry, my integrity for inflexibility. He'd thought I was a small person with small ambitions who could be crushed by a big voice and bigger threats. He'd been wrong about everything. That night, Patricia called with an update. The SEC has frozen Bradley's assets pending investigation. The U.S. Attorney's Office is preparing criminal charges. And Lena Ardentium's board wants to talk to you about coming back as CFO. I actually laughed for the first time in 2 weeks. "Tell them I'll think about it, but my contract will specify that I leave at 5. Because that's who I was. Not a 9-to-5 drone or a clock watcher, or any of the small words Bradley had used to diminish me. I was a professional who understood that boundaries weren't weaknesses, they were the foundations of integrity. And integrity, as Bradley Houghton had learned, could bring down empires. The boardroom at 3 p.m. Monday felt like a different universe from the one Bradley had commanded just days before. Gone were the IPO countdown clocks and motivational posters. In their place sat stern-faced board members, external auditors, and representatives from the North Carolina Department of the Secretary of State. I wasn't invited to this particular meeting, but I didn't need to be. Raj kept me updated via carefully worded texts, each one painting a clearer picture of the unfolding disaster. External auditors just announced preliminary findings. Missing documentation everywhere. Board member asking why risk assessments were overridden. Someone just asked who approved Halverson Trust. Room went silent. At 3:47, my phone rang. An unknown Charlotte number. "Miss Wakefield, this is Harrison Whitfield, chairman of Ardentium's board. Are you available to join an emergency session? We need your expertise." "I'm on administrative leave, Mr. Whitfield." "That's been rescinded. Effective immediately. Please, we need someone who understands the full scope of what we're facing." I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The boardroom I entered looked like a crime scene. Bankers' boxes lined the walls, laptops and documents covered every surface, and the smell of burnt coffee mixed with flop sweat. At the head of the table, Harrison Whitfield looked like he'd aged a decade since the IPO announcement. "Lena, thank you for coming." He gestured to an empty chair. "We need to understand the extent of the vendor irregularities." I remained standing. "With respect, Mr. Whitfield, I documented these concerns weeks ago. My reports were deleted from the system. We're aware. We're also aware that you filed a whistleblower complaint with the SEC. He rubbed his temples. "What we need now is damage control. Can you help us?" I looked around the room at the faces that had enabled Bradley's rampage through action or inaction, greed or cowardice. Part of me wanted to walk out, let them drown in the mess they'd created. But then I thought about the employees like Raj, like Michael, like Roberto. The ones who just wanted to do their jobs without becoming casualties of executive ego. "I'll help," I said finally, "but only under certain conditions." "Name them." "Full reinstatement with back pay. Written acknowledgement that I acted properly in reporting concerns. And complete access to all systems and records, no restrictions, no oversight." "Done." "I'm not finished. I also want a board resolution committing to cooperation with all federal investigations. No scapegoating, no cover-ups. And Bradley Houghton's entire leadership team needs to be suspended pending investigation." Whitfield exchanged glances with the other board members. "That's extensive." That's non-negotiable. A heavy silence filled the room. Finally, Whitfield nodded. Draft the resolution. We'll sign it. I spent the next 4 hours performing forensic triage on Ardentium's financials. The scope of Bradley's fraud was breathtaking, not just the 7 shell companies I'd identified, but an entire ecosystem of inflated contracts, circular transactions, and phantom services. The $720 million valuation wasn't just optimistic, it was fiction. As I worked, people began trickling in with information. Employees who'd been too scared to speak up while Bradley prowled the halls now came forward with documentation concerns, evidence they'd quietly preserved. He had me backdate invoices, said Jennifer from accounting. Told me to approve expenses without receipts, added David from procurement. Made me create user accounts for companies that never accessed our systems, admitted someone from IT. Each confession added another piece to the mosaic of fraud. By 7 p.m., we'd identified over $40 million in questionable transactions, all flowing to entities connected to Bradley's offshore network. Whitfield stared at the summary I'd prepared, his face gray. How did we miss this? You didn't miss it, I said quietly. You ignored it. Every time someone raised concerns, they were labeled difficult, negative, not aligned with company culture. Jessica Malone tried to warn you. So did Marla Goines. So did I. The board was told they resigned for personal reasons. The board chose to believe what was convenient. He had no response to that. At 8:15, an SEC enforcement team arrived. Unlike the panicked scrambling of the afternoon, their entrance was methodical, systematic. They knew exactly what they were looking for because I'd told them where to find it. Mr. Whitfield, the lead investigator, announced, we need to secure all electronic devices and documents related to the planned IPO. No one is to leave until we've conducted initial interviews. I started to pack up my laptop. Not you, Miss Wakefield, the investigator said. We'd like you to stay. Your cooperation has been invaluable. For the next 3 hours, I walked the SEC team through Ardentium's systems, showing them the digital breadcrumbs Bradley had left in his arrogance. The deleted files he thought were gone forever recovered from backup servers. The email chains he'd conducted from his personal account, not realizing our security system, captured external communications. The login patterns that showed him accessing shell company accounts during board meetings where he claimed ignorance. This is remarkably thorough, the lead investigator commented. Your documentation is impeccable. I'm an accountant, I replied. Documentation is what we do. By midnight, the initial phase was complete. The SEC had what they needed to freeze assets, subpoena records, and begin building a criminal case that would likely send Bradley Houghton to federal prison for a very long time. As I finally prepared to leave, Whitfield stopped me at the door. Lena, I owe you an apology. We should have listened. I thought about all the appropriate responses: gracious acceptance, professional deflection, corporate politeness. Instead, I told him the truth. Yes, you should have. But you were too busy chasing a $720 million fantasy to notice the crime happening in your own building. Bradley didn't destroy this company's reputation, he just exposed what was already broken. Will you stay? Help us rebuild the CFO position? I'll think about it. But know this: if I stay, things change. Real oversight, real accountability. And Mr. Whitfield, I still leave at 5. He managed a tired smile. Somehow I don't think that will be a problem anymore. As I walked through Ardentium's empty halls one last time, I thought about the journey from that Monday afternoon when Bradley screamed at me for keeping my contract. 2 weeks. That's all it had taken to bring down a $720 million fraud. Not with shouting or threats or power plays, but with quiet determination, careful documentation, and the revolutionary act of doing my job exactly as it should be done. The security office was empty except for one person. Roberto looked up as I passed. Heard the news? He said simply. Proud of you, Miss Wakefield. Thank you for the video, Roberto. That was brave. He shrugged. Just doing my job, documenting what I saw. Like you taught me, always keep records. I smiled. Always keep records. The Charlotte night was warm and humid, full of crickets and possibility. Somewhere Bradley Houghton was probably meeting with his criminal defense team, trying to figure out how a woman who left at 5 had destroyed his empire. The answer was simple, really. He'd confused fear with respect volume, with authority fraud with innovation. He'd believed his own myth, that rules were for small people, that integrity was a luxury, that anyone who stood in his way could be crushed. He'd been wrong. And in approximately 72 hours, when the SEC's investigation became public and the U.S. attorney filed charges, everyone would know exactly how wrong he'd been. The news broke at 6:52 p.m. on Tuesday, like a thunderclap across Charlotte's financial district. The first alert came from Bloomberg. SEC halts Ardentium Metrics IPO amid fraud investigation. Within minutes, every financial news outlet had picked up the story. My phone began buzzing with calls from reporters, but I let them all go to voicemail. The evidence would speak louder than any quote I could give. I was at my kitchen table laptop open to Ardentium's investor portal, watching in real time as the company's valuation evaporated. The IPO microsite, which had boasted about revolutionary growth potential, just yesterday now displayed a stark message: IPO temporarily suspended pending regulatory review. Temporarily. That was corporate speak for dead and buried. Thomas Garrett called at 7:10. The U.S. attorney just unsealed the indictment. Bradley's been charged with 15 counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. They're also charging 2 of his VPs who helped coordinate the shell companies. What about the company? Ardentium will likely face civil penalties, but criminal charges are focused on individuals. Your documentation made it clear the fraud was contained to Bradley's circle, not systemic. I thought about all the employees who'd have to face the embarrassment, the career uncertainty, the taint of association with a failed IPO. They deserved better than to be collateral damage in Bradley's greed. There's something else, Garrett continued. The SEC's preliminary estimate puts the fraudulent inflation at around $200 million. Under whistleblower provisions, you could be looking at a substantial reward. How substantial? Potentially 10 to 30% of recovered funds. We're talking millions, Lena. I closed my eyes and let that sink in. Millions. More money than I'd ever dreamed of, certainly more than a financial operations manager who left at 5 would typically see. But it wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. By 8 p.m., the story had evolved. Local news led with Charlotte executive arrested in IPO scandal. The footage was grainy but unmistakable: Bradley Houghton being led from his Ballantine mansion in handcuffs, his perfect hair mussed, his designer shirt untucked. He kept his head down, no trace of the swagger that had filled Ardentium's lobby 3 weeks ago. Sandra Kowalski called at 8:30. Lena, the board has convened an emergency session. We need you here, now. Sandra, I'm not... Please. The SEC is demanding a complete audit trail. You're the only one who understands the full scope. We need your help to save what's left of the company. I thought about saying no, about letting them figure it out themselves. But then I remembered Raj Michael Roberto and the hundreds of other employees who'd done nothing wrong except work for a company with corrupt leadership. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Ardentium's offices were in chaos. SEC investigators occupied the executive floor. Banker boxes were being wheeled out by the dozen, and employees clustered in break rooms, speaking in hushed, worried tones. I badged in with my newly reactivated credentials and headed straight for the boardroom. The scene inside was barely controlled panic. Board members huddled with lawyers, CFO candidates, interviewed via video link, and Harrison Whitfield stood at the center, like a captain on a sinking ship. Lena, thank God. He grabbed my arm. The SEC wants a complete forensic accounting by Thursday. Can you... I've already done it. I pulled out my laptop and connected it to the presentation screen. I've been maintaining parallel records for the past 3 months. The room fell silent as I pulled up my files. Spreadsheets appeared showing the real numbers versus Bradley's fiction. Network diagrams traced the flow of funds through shell companies. Timeline charts showed when each fraudulent entry was made, by whom, and how it was concealed. This is... Whitfield stared at the screen. This is everything. Every transaction, every approval, every deleted file. I clicked through the evidence with practiced efficiency. The actual valuation removing all fraudulent inflation is approximately $480 million. Still substantial but realistic. Can we salvage the IPO? Not the current one, but with full cooperation, transparent disclosure, and new leadership, maybe in 12 to 18 months. A board member I didn't recognize leaned forward. Miss Wakefield, would you consider serving as interim CFO? The company needs someone with your integrity. Before I could respond, commotion erupted in the hallway. Through the glass walls, we could see FBI agents escorting someone from the IT department. Word spread quickly they were arresting the IT director who'd helped Bradley delete the original vendor files. That could have been me, Michael Torres said quietly from across the table. If Lena hadn't given me the courage to come forward. You found your own courage, I told him. I just showed you it was possible to use it. The meeting continued past midnight as we worked to separate Ardentium's legitimate business from Bradley's web of fraud. The company that emerged from our analysis was smaller, less flashy, but fundamentally sound. It was what Ardentium could have been without the lies. At 1 a.m., Whitfield called a break. Lena, I need an answer about the CFO position. I looked around the room at the exhausted faces, the scattered papers, the weight of failure and possibility mingling in the air. I'll do it, but only as interim and only under specific conditions, which are full autonomy in financial operations, direct reporting to the board, not the CEO, mandatory ethics training for all executives, and the establishment of an anonymous whistleblower hotline that reports directly to an independent ombudsman. Anything else? I smiled. Core hours are 8 to 5, non-negotiable. Whitfield extended his hand. Welcome aboard, interim CFO Wakefield. As I shook his hand, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Ardentium metrics from IPO dream to compliance nightmare. The article detailed Bradley's fraud, the heroic whistleblower who'd exposed it, and the company's scramble to survive. They called me heroic, but I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like what I'd always been, an accountant who understood that numbers don't lie even when executives do. A professional who knew that integrity wasn't just about being honest when it was easy, but especially when it was hard. By 2 a.m., the emergency session finally wound down. As I packed up my laptop, now officially Ardentium's interim CFO, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me here. 3 weeks ago, Bradley Houghton had screamed at me for leaving at 5. Now he was in federal custody, his $720 million dream revealed as a criminal conspiracy. The security desk was empty as I headed for the exit. Roberto's shift had ended hours ago. But there was a note taped to the turnstile. Congratulations, CFO Wakefield. I smiled and pocketed the note. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, salvaging the company's reputation, rebuilding trust with investors, and creating the kind of ethical culture that would prevent another Bradley Houghton from taking root. But tonight I was going home. It was 2:15 a.m., well past my contracted hours. But for once, the overtime felt worth it. Not because I was chasing some impossible valuation or feeding someone's ego, but because I was doing what I'd always done, my job with precision, integrity, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing right from wrong. The Charlotte night was still and humid as I walked to my car. Somewhere Bradley Houghton was learning what happened when you mistook bullying for leadership fraud, for innovation and silence for submission. And somewhere in homes across the city, Ardentium employees were sleeping a little better knowing that someone had stood up, spoken out, and refused to be intimidated. All because I left at 5. The rain started at 4:53 p.m. on Friday, September 27th, exactly 1 month after Bradley Houghton had screamed at me in Ardentium's lobby. I watched it streak down my office windows as I reviewed the final forensic report that would seal his fate and perhaps save our company. My assistant knocked and entered. Lena, the SEC enforcement director, is here for the 5 o'clock meeting. I glanced at my watch, 4:58. Send them in. The enforcement team entered with the gravity of people who wielded the power to destroy corporations. But their expressions held something else: respect, maybe even admiration. Ms. Wakefield, The lead investigator began. Your documentation has been instrumental. Because of your meticulous records, we've frozen over $60 million in fraudulent transfers. Bradley Houghton and his co-conspirators are facing decades in prison. I was just doing my job. No, she corrected. You did much more than that. You risked everything to expose this fraud. Which brings me to why we're here. She placed a formal document on my desk. The SEC has approved your whistleblower award, $18.6 million. The number hung in the air like a physical thing, $18.6 million. More money than generations of my family had ever seen. I stared at the document, thinking about the journey from that first scream to this moment. There's more, she continued. Ardentium's board has agreed to full cooperation. The company will pay additional civil penalties, but criminal prosecution will focus on the individuals responsible. Thanks to your clear documentation showing the fraud was contained to Bradley's circle, Ardentium can survive. As if on cue, my phone buzzed. A text from Raj. All hands meeting results. 87% vote to continue operations under new leadership. We're going to make it. The SEC team left at 5:20 after I'd signed the necessary paperwork. I sat alone in my office, the CFO's office now, and let the magnitude wash over me. Not just the money, though, that was life-changing, but the validation that doing right mattered, that integrity had value beyond any stock option. My desk phone rang. An unknown number with a federal prefix. Ms. Wakefield, this is Bradley Houghton. My hand tightened on the receiver. You're calling from federal custody. One phone call. I chose you. His voice was smaller now, stripped of its corporate armor. I need to know why you could have played along. Made millions when we went public. Why throw it all away? I didn't throw anything away, Bradley. I preserved it. My integrity, my profession's standards, the trust of everyone who relies on accurate financial reporting. For what? To be some mid-level accountant your whole life. I almost laughed. Even now he didn't understand. I'm the CFO of a company that will survive your fraud. I have the respect of my colleagues and the trust of federal regulators. And Bradley, I have $18.6 million in whistleblower rewards. Turns out integrity pays better than fraud. The silence stretched so long I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Then quietly, I picked the wrong person to scream at. No, Bradley, you picked the wrong path entirely. The person you screamed at was just the one who refused to follow you down it. He hung up without another word. By 6 p.m., the office had emptied except for a few dedicated souls. I pulled on my raincoat and grabbed the banker's box containing my personal items. The same one security had watched me pack a month ago. This time I was taking it to the executive floor permanently. In the lobby, Roberto was just starting his evening shift. He snapped to attention when he saw me. CFO Wakefield, working late on a Friday. I checked my watch, 6:07 p.m. Just wrapping up some SEC business, but I'm heading home now. Good, he said with a smile. Even CFOs need rest. As I pushed through the revolving doors into the September rain, I thought about cycles, how Bradley had screamed at me for leaving at 5. How that moment had set in motion the complete destruction of his fraud. How it had all come full circle with me leaving again, but this time as the person who'd saved the company he'd tried to loot. The rain was warm and clean, washing the city fresh. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting it soak through my coat, thinking about the employees who still had jobs, the investors who'd been protected from a fraudulent IPO, the message sent to every corporate predator who thought rules didn't apply to them. My phone buzzed with messages. Congratulations from former colleagues, interview requests from financial media, an invitation to speak at the National Association of Corporate Directors. I ignored them all. There would be time for that later. Tonight I was just Lena Wakefield, an accountant who'd done her job and gone home on time. The fact that doing so had exposed a $720 million fraud, sent a corrupt executive to prison and earned me millions in rewards, well, that was just proof that sometimes the universe rewards those who stand their ground. I unlocked my car and placed the banker's box in the back seat. Somewhere in Charlotte, Bradley Houghton was learning that federal prison didn't care about your Armani suits or your IPO dreams. Somewhere Ardentium employees were toasting their survival with Friday evening drinks. And somewhere other financial professionals were finding the courage to speak up about the frauds they'd witnessed, knowing it was possible to win. As for me, I was going home to my Friday evening routine, a run through Freedom Park dinner at my favorite local restaurant, maybe a glass of wine while reviewing the sustainable business plan we'd build for Ardentium's future. A future based on real numbers, honest valuations, and the revolutionary idea that integrity wasn't a weakness but a strength. The rain intensified. As I pulled out of the parking garage, turning the streets into rivers of reflected light, I thought about Bradley's question, why throw it all away? But I hadn't thrown anything away. I'd invested it, leveraged it, multiplied it into something worth more than any IPO. I'd proven that a woman who leaves at 5 can bring down a man who thought the rules didn't apply to him. That documentation beats intimidation. That patience and precision are more powerful than any screaming tantrum. Most importantly, I'd proven that integrity isn't just its own reward. Sometimes it's worth $18.6 million and the satisfaction of watching a fraudster's empire crumble. I merged into traffic windshield wipers, beating a steady rhythm, and allowed myself one small smile. Bradley Houghton had been right about one thing: this wasn't kindergarten. It was better. Because in kindergarten they teach you to play fair and tell the truth. And that's exactly what I'd done. The dashboard clock read 6:32 p.m. as I headed home through the Charlotte evening. Late by my standards, but worth it to close this chapter. Come Monday, I'd be back at 8 sharp, ready to rebuild Ardentium into the company it should have been all along. But tonight, I was just another commuter heading home after work, carrying the quiet satisfaction of a job well done and the knowledge that sometimes leaving at 5 is the most powerful thing you can do. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean, carrying away the debris of Bradley's fraud like so much corporate detritus. And I drove through it all unhurried and unworried, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but confident in my ability to meet them. With integrity, with precision, and always with my eye on the clock to make sure I honored my commitments to my contract, to my principles, and to myself. Because that's who I was. Not a hero or a crusader, just an accountant who understood that numbers never lie, even when executives do. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below, so we can connect and exchange our thoughts about workplace justice and standing up for what's right. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. And don't forget to press that hype button to help more people discover this tale of integrity, triumphing over corporate corruption. Your support means everything.